Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking a bit about media images of social class. One thing we want to start with is thinking about the US and its relationship to the media. And basically what we want to understand is the fact that the US is a highly media-oriented society. The media has a substantial impact, for example, on how people view the social class system and the different groups in it. And especially because people tend to live with and associate with people in their own class, how they see others can be largely framed by the portrayal of different class groups in the media. So to say that another way, the media has power over us to view various social classes, not just the one that we belong to, but also ones that we rarely, if ever, have contact with. And they shape how we view those social classes. So the media can make certain images of social class groups seem like a natural part of the way things are in society, when in fact the media is creating as well as reflecting that picture. We have lots of social science research to show this to be true. In addition, we've also found through research that the mass media have the power to shape public support for policies, and also things like for issues like public assistance, among others. And we'll be talking more about the issue of public assistance and poverty and government, support and all of that a little bit later in the semester. We need to understand that the media is a social institution. And what we mean by that is that, they assume a lot of different functions that were formerly served by more traditional social institutions like the church, the school, government, family, and so on. In Western countries, though, we operate on sort of a private ownership model, and that's especially in the United States. Media systems were never intended to serve as a social institution to replace things like school, government, family, and their influence. Instead, the basic objective of privately owned media organizations was to be, a profit-making entity, to make profit for a company, right? A money-making business. So a lot of films, TV programs, websites, they have, for example, sexual content and violent content and things like that are designed to attract the largest imaginable audience. The messages that are contained in a lot of the programs that we see can be sometimes confusing or disruptive to a public that are looking to the media for direction, for purpose, for meaning. And so some scholars argue that the public's reliance on the Western media for guidance and support can be kind of dangerous. So within that context, we need to sort of think about media literacy and how it provides perhaps strategies that let people critically examine media messages and put media programming into a more meaningful perspective. Thinking sociologically, what we mean by meaningful perspective is to allow them to also understand the media's role in their own life and sort of to think about, through the sociological imagination, their own personal troubles within a larger kind of context of social forces, including sort of our current moment with media saturation. Okay? C. Wright Mills is an important sociologist to bring up here, and you may recognize him also from what I just mentioned, the fact that he is sort of the modern father of sociology who coined that term, the sociological imagination. He basically argued back in the 50s that, there was a growing tendency for the mass media to be a manipulative device rather than a channel for the interchange of opinions. And he stressed that the media wasn't persuading anything of people. They weren't a persuasive medium, but rather that they were a manipulative one, that they were manipulating people in a sense. And so he wrote a book in the 1956 called The Power Elite. And here what he argues is he looks at the relationships among political, military, and economic elites, and he notes that they sort of have this common worldview, and that power rests in the centralization of authority within the elites of society. So how does that relate to this? Well, in today's world, the way that we can sort of look at his work over 50 years later is that the power in society rests in the fact that authority is held by very few people, and the media is owned by very few people. And the folks who own the media, those elites of society, that they really have a stranglehold on authority, in a sense, and on power. He argued also that, he also argued that the media, he argued, was a malign force, right, meaning a dangerous one, because they're thought not to be successful in helping individuals to understand and make sense of their own social milieu and in transcending it, but rather that the mass media failed to sort of help us as individuals connect between our personal troubles and the public issues that they're a part of. And so the mass media, again, are seen as maintaining sort of an ongoing general tone of what he called animated discussion and suspended agitation, right? And so this might sound somewhat familiar to us. A lot of what Mills wrote is, some see as sort of prophetic because it still has a lot of weight in today's society, and perhaps even more so because media is so much more a part of our lives than it was when he was writing in the 1950s. So, in other words, we can think about how the media is kind of this propaganda machine, he might argue, right? That they have all of this power over us, and that the media, in a sense, have been instrumental in transforming America into what he and other scholars call a mass society, right? The media, in a way, are tools that are available for use by the elites, and the owners or operators of media organizations are themselves members or even servants of those same power elites, right? And we see these ideas repeated later by other scholars like Herman and even someone like Noam Chomsky. Here's an interesting image I just wanted to pull up and have you take a look at. And, I think it's pretty obvious what the point is here. The media can take something like a picture in the middle, and depending on how they represent the issue, it could either make it seem like, someone was being helped or someone was being hurt, right? And so, in a sense, the media has this power to manipulate our viewpoints potentially in terms of what they want us to see and what we can see. And so they're shaping our perspectives of a particular situation, right? And they provide different viewpoints for, of various issues and various social issues that are important to all of our lives. Another point I wanted to bring up is the idea that the media serves a critical role in what we call the legitimation process. What they do is that, in a sense, is that they serve as an arbiter, if you will, of major sources of information. So they give us a lot of knowledge about society, right? So we think about the ways that we get our news. Even though today newspapers are dying out in their physical form, right? Actual physical newspapers that you can hold and touch. Same thing with magazines. They're still out there, but they're much fewer in circulation than there used to be. But today, right, the media, it's not as if they're dying off, they just are changing, they're evolving. And so a lot of where people get their news now is in some sort of online format, whether or not it's through an actual newspaper online, through a website, or whether it's through, other outlets, other smaller outlets, or even through our friends' Facebook feeds. That still counts. Social media is a part of the media, right? So first off, that they're a major source of information. Secondly, many scholars argue that they function as a propaganda mechanism, if you will. So again, they aim to persuade the public to do a lot of different types of things. You could think about them as persuading us to support certain policies, but you could also think about them as persuading us to buy products, right? A lot of the media wouldn't exist, if not most of it, if it wasn't for advertising, right? And so if we think about television, for example, all of our TV shows, without advertising dollars, it would dry up in a sense. And so we're persuading, the media is persuading the public to do various things, to support certain policies or ways of life, as well as to sort of, maybe be pushed towards buying certain products. And lastly, that the media serves as a primary agent of socialization, meaning that it instructs people in the norms and values of their society, right? It tells people, in a sense, what they should do, right? What's normal, what's considered sort of standard or default, and kind of pushes us in certain ways towards certain things and away from others, and gives us also a sense of the values that we should have in society. We've already started to talk a little bit in this class about that. So all of these functions, these three major things I've just talked about, contribute to this process of legitimation and generates a mass belief in and a mass acceptance of dominant political and economic institutions, and acceptance also of the system of inequality in a lot of ways. Okay? And so we want to think a little bit about, how this happens. How is it that the media is able to generate some sort of a mass belief? What's a concept that can help us to understand that? That is my dog. And so it brings us to this concept from Antonio Gramsci of hegemony. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist intellectual, and he was interested in how control was maintained within society. In particular, he focused on the role of ideology. And so hegemony is about ideological power. Hegemony is about how the ruling class use ideology to control the masses. In other words, how the ruling class shape people's minds. And it describes the process by which the ruling class persuade other groups to adopt their view of society as simple common sense. Now, let's try to break that down a little bit more. We might be able to think of hegemony in the way that we might have thought of the Titanic, because hegemony is supremely relevant to all of our lives. It's central to almost everything that even sociology has to teach us, but it's hard to explain in a simple manner because it's basically invisible. So here's the example with the Titanic that hopefully will help to dissect this complex concept. If we think about the sinking Titanic, I think it's a good metaphor for hegemony. Hopefully some of you, if not all of you, have maybe seen the movie or seen scenes from the movie or know part of what it's about. And you understand that from watching that movie that many of the less affluent people on the bottom decks of the ship were unable to get off the ship and they drowned, right? In the movie, the ship's crew seals a door shut to prevent the less fortunate passengers, the less wealthy passengers, from making it to the top deck. And that ensured that the rich had easier access to the lifeboats. This is a good way to think about and a good metaphor for social stratification and competition for scarce resources. What if, for example, people on the lower decks of the Titanic decided that it was in their best interest to seal the doors on themselves, right? Not that someone else did it to them, but that they sealed the doors on themselves, and they sat there and they patiently just waited for death, right? If the people on those lower decks had been convinced by the people on the top decks that it was in their best interest to do that, this would be hegemonic, right? That would be an example of hegemony, right? So what's interesting, though, hegemony is not just about some unfortunate group of people. The thing about hegemony is that all of us have sort of been exploited by people with more privilege and more advantage than us at some point, right? And so the thing about hegemony is that we all sort of start to internalize this sense that whatever view of society is represented in the mass media, that becomes sort of the norm. That stands in for common sense. Another way to kind of look at this notion of hegemony is through this quote by Malcolm X, right? If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing, right? So here, for example, we can see how hegemony can be achieved by the ruling class in this way, right? That they can sort of change our viewpoint on who it is that we should be loving and who we should be hating, or who we should be listening to and who we shouldn't, in a sense.